Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few seconds. I will share my screen. Thank you for returning on a snowy afternoon here in Baltimore. That wasn't a joke either. Play from current slide. So firstly, we should all be very excited that we have a celebrity sitting among us tonight, who was just featured in the Baltimore Jewish Times, Dr. Neil Rubin. So if you're in his group, you should ask him about the lovely essay written about him that made us all so proud. I say that a little bit facetiously. He can tell you why, but it actually is quite a lovely profile of all the great things Dr. Rubin has done over the last number of years. I wasn't going to put a number to it, don't worry, but many years. So tonight is our 5th class, and some of you might have been relieved that the readings were a little bit easier to read, but probably a little bit tense because the topic itself is, as it was then and now, quite fraught, and people bring a lot of emotions to this particular topic. We are going to look at Buber's Theo-Politics, and in particular, in the second part of the class, we're going to analyze his correspondence with Gandhi regarding the Israel-Palestine question. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to review last class just very, very briefly and try to understand how I and thou can start to play a role in politics and in our political environment, but also to remind us that a topic such as this can lend itself to so many missed meetings. It's really hard to gauge the goodwill and intentions of different points of view, especially when talking about this particular conflict and this particular situation. And so just keep in mind that this is where you're going to put your dialogical skills to work, because I guarantee you that not all of you agree on the best way forward or even what the situation is. As many of you know, this doesn't always bring out the best impulses in people when talking about it. But we've had 4 weeks of Buber, so we're going to try it out. And then I have 3 anecdotes in Buber's life to situate him in a way that will allow you to make sense of his response to Gandhi. I want to talk about his books and the life of his books and the travel of his books, because one, it's a fascinating story, but it also tells you a deeper story about Buber's life. I then want to talk about his appointment to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the first lecture he gave there. Buber was a little reticent to go to Jerusalem because he knew that he wouldn't necessarily be welcome there. Also, at 60 years old, he was going to have to learn how to speak modern Hebrew in order to teach at the university and to write in modern Hebrew. And so while he had an affinity for language and while he had a great knowledge of biblical and rabbinic Hebrew, this was going to be something new. And then I also want to talk about a cherished relationship he had with Yehuda Leib Magnus, who's not always talked about in the, we'll say the liberal Zionist narrative, but is an important person in this conversation. We'll have our breakout room. I'll give you a very brief introduction to Buber and Gandhi, and then we'll spend the rest of the evening analyzing texts, the letters. I lifted out some of the passages, and then I have some breakout room conversations for you regarding that. So let's get started. Oh, and the picture to your left, that is from the library of the Van Leer Institute, which was built maybe a block or 2 blocks from where Buber's last residence was. And so it's an important place in Buber's studies. Now, my dissertation advisor many years ago, Paul Mendes-Flohr, really liked Robert Frost and would share his poetry very often in all of our classes in Jewish thought or modern Jewish thought. And I thought this poem would be a nice way for us to start the evening, because there are many ways to read it. So it starts, before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. So in the I, it, I, thou encounters, we build walls around ourselves. Just in basic grammar, like the Z and the do, we create walls, and whether or not we engage people. But obviously in politics, we build barriers between people. There's something in the constructing of walls that discloses our orientation to dialogue. And I think that that Frost's poem is a nice meditation on that. The letter you see here to the left, and it's really hard to make out, but it's a letter that Martin Buber wrote to President Lyndon Johnson, expressing his support for Martin Luther King Jr. And that he take very seriously the liberty fighters. And so it's a letter of endorsement to show that the Buber actually had opinions about what was going on in the United States too, as we'll find out. And it played a role in his own relationships in Jerusalem. So in the wake of World War I, Buber was cognizant of the existing political structures of states. The orientation towards nationalism and forms of capitalism were contributing to a world where it was difficult to have IU relations. And so we talked about this last week. To be a nationalist makes it very difficult for you to actually have I-thou or IU relations. But then to be an individualist, or even just an entrepreneurial capitalist, seeing things as means to an end, and how you value people and time, right? The phrase time is money, creates ways in which you relate to the world that is utilitarian, and you objectify things around you. The social structures themselves contained elements of exploitation, domination, oppression, that inherently created frameworks in which human beings were led to treat and act toward other human beings in the form of I-it relations. So for instance, if you read some of the history of African Americans in this country, and the impact of the slave trade and being enslaved people, the it had gotten into such an insidious place that human beings as actual, as enslaved people, played a role in the development and cultivation of culture that would impact for generations, for centuries, how human beings, even in contemporary day, will interact with one another. That the damage and violence done to these really extreme forms of I-it are not easily undone, and debatable whether they can even be undone. And this is something for Buber very important. So think, for example, the constructions of race, religion, gender, and class. In another venue, in one of our other programs, we were having a conversation about whether or not certain persecuted peoples can actually engage in authentic identity, in the sense that what we might perceive as authenticity may have been stripped from people, because their lives and identity is always having to react to others, in the sense that they're of prejudice. The simple example is that some people get to walk out the door in the morning and know that they can walk back by the end of the day, and very little has changed. For other people, they walk out of the door and they know they have to navigate all sorts of minefields based on who they are, and based on how the world perceives them, which is not just exhausting, but it's stressful and can impact the way in which you see yourself in relation to the world. All of these things were manufactured by a system of I-it that Buber wants to transcend. And so how do you undo the violence in society to create conditions for IU relationships? So these are the concerns for Buber that inform his view of Zionism. States were structures of domination and hierarchy. He was concerned that linking a state with one group, in this case Jews, would create a risk of one group dominating another within its borders. So this was a concern from him all the way back into the teens and 20s. So he proposed a binational state, which he hoped would circumvent some of the problems associated with nationalism. So it would be an identity that included more than one group of people. Buber connected these social and political ideas to ideas he saw coming out of the Hebrew Bible. So going back to the class on Hasidism and his views of Jesus and his views of Baal Shem Tov and Spinoza, that there's some ideas that come out of the Hebrew Bible that get pushed back in order to preserve certain status quo structures or status quo society. And Buber sees the Hebrew Bible as a way of resisting that. So take, for example, we have Passover coming up, Pesach, in which we celebrate or commemorate the Exodus from Egypt, in which the Egyptians persecuted the Israelites and that the Israelites are liberated. But the Torah also teaches, the book before, that the Israelites or a certain Israelite persecuted a certain Egyptian. So Sarah, the matriarch, persecuted Hagar, the maidservant, the Egyptian maidservant. And interestingly, the word Hagar, the name Hagar, means in Hebrew, Hagar, the stranger. So Sarah persecuted the stranger. And interestingly, the stranger is the only one, Hagar, that actually gets to name God in the Hebrew Bible. The names God El Roi, the God who sees me. The idea is that you want to transcend the narrative of persecuted and persecutor, and that the Torah teaches that you're not fully free until the conditions for persecution are eradicated. It's not just that everybody is free, but that the cycle of violence of being a persecuted person or being the persecutor is completely eradicated from our worldview. He saw the Bible as arguing that human kinship and other forms of domination undermine proper service of God. God is king, and he's using king in the biblical sense. He's quoting the Bible, but no human being can put forth institutional rulership over human beings. So if God is the transcendent, no other human being can stand over any other human being. So there's what we're going to call a theological anarchism for Buber. And the kinship of God enables human beings to relate to one another as equals, without dominating hierarchies. So in order to get rid of dominating hierarchies, you have to change the conditions in society that value these hierarchies, rich and poor, racism. So the ways in which we have set up our structures to either persecute or to elevate people, how do we change those so that we can relate to each other once again as yous? So a few guiding questions for tonight. The first question would be, are there certain social political forms that would enable people to relate to one another in an IU way? So you can think in a micro environment. You don't have to solve all of society's woes, but think of communities or townships or cities. How do certain current political structures make it difficult for people to relate to others as you? And it could also be just our general media. I signed up for Twitter last week, which may actually be a mistake, although I didn't have the attention span for it. But there's not a whole lot of IU relationships on Twitter. Debatably any. Is Buber's view of Zionism helpful or not helpful in trying to find a peaceful way forward for Palestinians and Israelis? We're not going to answer this question tonight, by the way, but I want it to be in your mind, even in the forefront of your mind as we go through some of Buber's views. Is Buber's view of Zionism helpful or not helpful in trying to find a peaceful way forward for Democrats and Republicans in the United States? There is intransigence on multiple levels, and people are not seeing each other anymore, or even the potential to see one another as you. Few takeaways from today's class. In Buber's thought, prophetic Judaism, Hasidism, and Zionism are all interrelated. So the previous two classes or three classes should help you see how when he articulates a view of Zionism, it's coming out of his fairly idiosyncratic views of prophetic Judaism and Hasidism. So both prophet and Hasid envision as a goal of Judaism the establishment of an I-thou community of people, meaning that the people have created a community that takes away the hierarchies in such a way that people can all have the possibility of relating to one another as you. Modern Zionism for Buber is the means by which Jews can realize this prophetic vision in the land to which they are inexorably linked by the covenant. Right, so this is an aspirational view of Zionism that was shared by some, dismissed by others. That Zionism becomes a moral mission for him that makes not just Jewish people better, but non-Jewish people as well. It's a universal political movement, as we'll see for Buber. And Buber regarded the kibbutz as a potential I-thou community. And though he was disillusioned with it later in life, he never abandoned his original hope for it. So that the kibbutz could have served as the exemplar of how you build I-thou communities in the land of Israel. His position in favor of a binational Palestine was far more controversial and caused him to be looked upon with suspicion and resentment by many Israelis. In fact, he knew when he was coming to Jerusalem that he didn't have many allies. But he longed for the establishment of a dialogical relationship between Jews and Arabs. And so when he does emigrate, all of his political work is to try to build bridges between Jews and the Arabs that live there, and to try to build a nation from both concerns. And you'll see with the Gandhi letter, that becomes very complicated. And this is where he became very controversial. The so-called Arab question for a lot of the political Zionists was the innermost Jewish question. So do we as Jews, for Buber, become like the rest of the nations and develop politics solely on I-it, domination, justifying violence, justifying injustice for the sake of political and military victories? Or do you do the work to try to build a state that doesn't come through the I-it politics? But why it was an innermost Jewish question is, for Buber, how Jews would relate to Arabs would actually determine a certain religious sensibility. And it would test the Jewish theological principles practiced politically. And reality proved to be stronger than his dream. So let's start talking about the stories, the three stories of Martin Buber. We have the problem again of a mother tongue, right? So Buber is at home in several languages, but he's also not entirely at home in it. And so he has to start over again in his 60s. And on Saturday, March 19th, 1938, Martin and Paola Buber and their two granddaughters boarded in Naples the Italian passenger ship, the SS Asperia, for a 6-day voyage to Haifa. 3 years later, it was torpedoed during the war. Now, Buber had been to Palestine a year before to look for a residence. And we're going to get to that story in a moment. But it was very difficult for them to leave, which we'll talk about very shortly. Having achieved the status of a respected German writer, Buber felt it would be unnatural to go over to Palestine as a Jewish or German writer, and thus without a profession tied to the Hebrew-speaking people living there. And so this is who he wrote to Hermann Gerson. Buber wanted to be an Israeli intellectual, and the only way that he could do it was be to live in Hebrew language. And again, this was difficult because there's a fear that he would not have the kind of mastery of modern Hebrew that he did other languages, which would then make him more difficult in his mind to be understood. The irony is that when you have fewer words, you have to be more creative, and sometimes you're better understood. All right, I'll tell you the story now because it's kind of funny. When after Buber gave his first lecture in Hebrew at the Hebrew University that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, someone had told him that they were really nervous in listening to him because they knew that Buber was opaque and ponderous and used a lot of academic discourse and language, but that he understood every word that Buber said and thought it was a clear and profound and powerful lecture. And Buber's response apparently was, that's because I don't know Hebrew well enough yet. Hopefully some of you laughed. And then before his immigration, he studied modern Hebrew with Abraham Joshua Heschel. And then later took lessons in Jerusalem and spoken Hebrew with the Hebraist Franz Raphael Aronstein. And so Buber had a lot of tutoring, he had a lot of help. And now you're starting to see certain relationships he had with other Jewish intellectuals. He and Heschel had a very interesting relationship. So Buber's religion in Jerusalem. So as you might have guessed, Buber was an anomalous Jew. He was critical of both traditionalist Jews and secular Jews, but he wasn't really in the middle. He was all over the place. But as a Zionist, he was unbending in his solidarity with the torments and needs of the natural Jew. So remember the Arthur Cohen distinction between the supernatural and natural Jew. The Jew of everyday life, the Jew of emancipation, the Jew of work, of language, Jews buffeted by the daily, often brutal realities of the historical situation in which they found themselves. The supernatural Jew is the Jew of Torah, the Jew of covenant, not really living in the world of the natural Jew. Remember, Buber wanted to unite these two worlds. He was equally unyielding in his objection to the Zionist quest for political sovereignty. So he was not a statist, which meant that he didn't want a political state. The idea was that it would be a shared state where Jews would have and develop an identity in terms of a nation as Jews, but it wouldn't be a state exclusively for Jews. You know, there's a saying in Israel, although it was the last time I lived there was when our daughter was born, and so that those sayings probably are gone because she's a teenager now. But I very often heard people say, and I lived in Buber's neighborhood, so people probably had the same politics as him, that to talk about a Jewish democracy in Israel was legitimate. It was a democracy for Jews, and it was Jewish for Arabs. In other words, that there was a feeling that Arabs didn't get a chance to participate in the democracy equally. That's coming out of Buber's intellectual milieu. He was very concerned about the statism of it. As a religious thinker, he sought to revive what he deemed the primal spiritual sensibilities of biblical Judaism that had been surpassed by normative strictures of the rabbis, right? So he's trying to uncover a suppressed religious theological element. So now I want to share with you the story of Bubers Books. It's a profound story. What's important to know is that Jews leaving Germany had to pay a tax, an exit tax of 25% of their net worth in order to leave. And then they had to pay other taxes if they were bringing things with them. Buber had a book collection of about 15,000 volumes and had nice furniture. And so to be taxed on that would be a lot. And so in order for them to move, they had to create the illusion that they weren't moving and that they were returning. So he left around 3,000 books in their place in Heppenheim, and sent the rest to Palestine. Because the Polish authorities seized his grandparents' property, which he inherited, he actually, while living his life, had a great deal of wealth, had very little when he moved to Jerusalem. And so he was very concerned about what his financial situation would be. Now, when he left for Jerusalem the year before, he was able to procure a what do you call it? An apartment in the West Jerusalem neighborhood of Talbia, and that is a picture of the apartment there on the left. And it was built in the 1930s by an Arab Christian named Yusuf Said, and the name Said might ring a bell for some of you. He was the grandfather of the famous literary critic Edward Said. And so Buber had rented a property by Edward Said's grandfather. And it had 3 big units and access to a basement. And Buber was able to move all of his books into the apartment and into the basement. But after 4 years, Said's daughter moved back from Cairo and wanted the lease to be broken so that she could move in with her 5 kids. And so it went to court and she won. And so Buber and Paula and all of their books and cats had to go somewhere else. And so when they moved, they were actually lucky because they moved to a place called Abu Tur. So those of you who've been to Jerusalem, Abu Tur is it's beautifully situated, and it was a very spacious home. And the landlord, a man named Yusuf Wahab Dajani, he and his wife spoke German. And it was just exciting for Buber and Paula didn't speak any Hebrew or Arabic, to be able to speak in German. And so in Abu Tur, they brought all of their books, all of their furniture, and in Abu Tur, they lived pretty happily, had salons with European Jews, with Palestinian Arabs. It was a very happy time for the Bubers. And then in 1947, the unrest broke out between the Haganah, the Jewish Defense Forces, and a number of different Arab armies. So Buber and his wife were actually forced to leave their home because there were bullet holes that made their way into the apartment, and people were forcing Buber and his wife to leave. They were almost in their 70s. The landlord of the house took all of the books, or didn't take the books yet. That's the second part. The landlord of the house helped them leave. And then there was fighting, and the Haganah actually used part of the Bubers' apartment and used some of the books to barricade themselves in some of the fighting. But when the Haganah had to retreat, and some Iraqi soldier volunteers occupied the area, the landlord of the building, Dajani, took the books and stored them securely in a room or in a basement, and kept the Bubers' possessions during all of the fighting. And the Bubers went to the neighborhood of Rehavia. And over the course of 3 months, every single night, the Dajanis, with helps of friends, put the books and valuables and the Bubers' 9 cats into sacks, and secretly, in a very clandestine way, transported Buber all of his books. And to know the risk, right? If the Dajanis were caught by either side, they would have been in an incredibly precarious place. There was something special about the relationship between the Dajanis and the Bubers that would allow them to risk their lives to bring Buber his books. There was something powerful about these books. And at the end of the course, I'm going to talk a little bit about that relationship in our last class. After the war, the state gives Buber a home of Palestinians who had fled to Turkey. and it was an enormous home that could house all of his books. And it was on the street Chovevei Zion. Those of you who've been to Jerusalem know that that's pretty close to the Van Leer Institute. It's in a beautiful part of the city. And that's where the Bubers lived for the rest of their days. And all of his books were placed there. But one part about the books that becomes an essential part of the story is that Buber didn't have any money, because Germany kept it all and kept his estate. And the university was not going to pay enough for them to live, especially given that his grandchildren and great-grandchildren were living with them. So what the Hebrew University did, and with the help of Judah Magnus, who we're going to talk about very shortly, is buy Bubers Books. And then they paid him over 10 years so that he could live, with the assumption that Bubers Books would be donated when he passed away. So that is Bubers Books. Oh, and as I was telling the story, I didn't show you the slideshow. I'm looking at the time. It took me a while to tell that story. I may have to jump ahead of his lecture. I just want to focus on 2 points of the lecture. There are 2 problems to our modern experience that he wanted to talk about in relation to Zionism. The modern individualism, which accepts one's destiny as isolated monad, not bound to others, so we're on our own. One's sense of homelessness in the world is to be affirmed by a universal amor fati, a love, or at least an acceptance of one's fate. But then there's modern collectivism, which he also has a problem with, because it provides one with the sense of home, but an illusory one, because it does not join person to person. The tender surface of personal life, which longs for contact with other life, is progressively deadened or desensitized by the collective. Man's isolation is not overcome here, but overpowered and numb. So it's very easy to pray to the idol of nationalism, of collectivism, because it really does stop your ability to engage others as potential yous. For Buber, the third way was Zionism. In that there is a third way to overcome cosmic and social isolation, to meet others as fellow human beings. So if the Zionists were able to meet Arabs not as a political obstacle, if the Arabs were able to meet the Zionists not as a political obstacle, but as fellow human beings, to know them in all their otherness as oneself, and from there break through to the other, then to build a common home in the world, you could have a genuine community. And so, as we see with Buber and Gandhi, they will talk about the fact that land conquest is inevitable to nationalism. So is it possible that in this situation, could it be different? And so he explores these laters in his book, Paths in Utopia. But I want to get to this essay that he wrote on the Holocaust before we start going to our breakout rooms, because it will be very helpful in trying to parse Buber and Gandhi's dispute. So when the news of Auschwitz came to Palestine, the Zionist leadership chose really not to draw a lot of attention to it. And so Buber and some friends organized a group called Adumi, Do Not Be Silent, asserting that we have to acknowledge the horror. Buber also spoke in the US about the Holocaust. He wrote a book called The Eclipse of God. There he argued that it was not simply an issue of God's absence, but rather our inattentiveness to the challenge of affirming life as Buber understood it. And rather than focus on theodicy, why did God ignore us, or why did God hide? God hiding his face, Hester Hapanim. We should focus on the way we failed to see God, and we as a collective we, all of us. As Heschel would later say, rather than ask God, where were you? Ask yourself, where was I? So his transition to public life from Germany to Palestine was very difficult. Because during the, up until 1938, Buber would lecture around Germany to Jews to maintain a spiritual resistance to Hitler. In Israel, he wrote very often in the Hebrew press. And on the first anniversary of Kristallnacht, Buber published a long analysis of anti-Semitism for Haaretz entitled They and We. I should say that the books that remained in his home in Heppenheim were also burned during Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht weighed very heavily on Buber. And so he wrote this essay for Haaretz, where we get a sense of his position on the Holocaust and of Zionism. But also know that this is 1939, so no news of concentration camps. We are not fulfilling our duty by mourning and complaining. We must learn from what has happened and transform what we have learned into action. So a strong Zionist message. We are finally building for ourselves a real house of our own, and in such a manner as one builds a house that is to last a long time. That is to say, on solid and strong foundations. The land cannot be built upon injustice. Whenever any state banishes from the area of protection and responsibility one of its minorities, one which is most conspicuous and annihilates it slowly or quickly, as Germany has done with Jews, in so doing, such a state shocks the foundations of its own existence. The Zionist project cannot be sustained by a national egoism like in Germany. The building for ourselves a real house of our own needs to take into account the communal and interpersonal life with respect to the Arabs of Palestine. So Buber develops a relationship with Magnus, and I'm going to jump ahead because I think that we need to get to our rooms. But I do want to read to you something that both of them wrote when they founded the society Ha'ol, the yoke, that advocated for a form of religious socialism. We are united in the feeling of responsibility towards society in general and the life of Israel in its land and in its dispersion in particular. This sense of responsibility stems from a faith in eternal values whose source is God. We believe in a life of faith which carries out a commitment to social action and practical political work, and we reject any attempt to separate the dominions, which are one in theory and practice. So the separation of secular and religious became a problem for them. I'm going to jump ahead again. So Ha'ol didn't really succeed as a political organization. However, Buber was so inspired by Magnus that in a letter he wrote, and he wrote the letter in German, and this is the important part before I send you into your rooms. These days we feel nearer than ever to you. These days we feel nearer than ever to you and to what you represent, Judah Magnus. In the near future, I believe the existence of individuals like you, persons of truth and responsibility, will become even more important. It is a joy to know that you are in this world. It is a consolation to be aware of the fact that one is fighting with you a common battle. May you enjoy the latent blessings of this quality of yours, which has become so rare, the courage of civil disobedience. So he wrote the word civil disobedience in English, because for Magnus, he was representing an American ethos coming from, at least in Buber's understanding, Henry David Thoreau, which represented the best of the American ethos. Civil disobedience, Buber wrote, obedience to a law superior to that which is being disobeyed here and now, expressed in individuals' ethical and existential integrity. You can transcend the it. In order to engage in politics, you can violate certain laws. So Buber drew inspiration from Magnus's resolve to translate the ethic of civil disobedience into a Jewish context, the struggle to create in Zion, a truly just society, and to rescue the Zionist project from the clutches of a narrow nationalism. I should also say that Magnus was a practicing pacifist, and considered himself, up until the dispute with Gandhi, as a follower of Gandhi. He himself was a controversial figure. But I'm going to send you the breakout rooms because we have things to read tonight. So for the next 20 minutes, discuss Buber's third way. He's critical of unbounded individualism, but is equally critical of unreflective collectivism. So he doesn't want us to just chart our own path, but he also doesn't want us to be beholden to a collectivism that implies exclusive participation. Must every we imply a they? This is a very deep question for Buber. How can people, while preserving and cultivating all their differences, imagine all of humanity as a we? How might the story of the journey of Bubers Books serve as a metaphor for the plight of European Jews in the 20th century? If a nation is founded on acts of violence and injustice, it, for Buber, plants the seeds for further violence and injustice. How do we replace violence with peace, injustice with justice, while preserving the unsettling truths of history and of collective memory? Most, if not all, nations today must grapple with these questions. How do we do it individually and collectively? And how can we broach these difficult questions interreligiously? And so I'm assuming that the next 20 minutes will go very quickly for you in your rooms. I look forward to seeing you soon. And we'll read Buber and Gandhi. All right, I see everybody coming back. Good. So you're going to go back out into your breakout rooms in 20 minutes, I promise. There's not as much material in this part. I sort of front loaded because I wanted to give you a lot of information to process some of this this debate. So welcome back. Here's a very brief introduction to the Buber Gandhi Chronicles. So one of Buber's first tasks upon arrival to Palestine in March 1938 was to respond to Gandhi's statement in Harajan, the statement that you read for today. And it was a test of Buber Zionism, because a duality to one's people and to humanity could not be realized in slogans and pious litanies, but would be tested in the crucible of everyday experience. Gandhi was really calling out Buber in a certain way, and trying to test the level of Buber's philosophy and political thinking. The Zionist settlement in Palestine provided a dramatic setting of such a test, because how could one satisfy the objectives of the Zionist project while honoring the political and human rights of the Arabs of Palestine? And so that was really the salient question that informed a lot of Buber's theological principles regarding the Zionist project. And so Gandhi is going to take issue with that. So I lifted out some parts of Gandhi's letter that I want to analyze with you before, and Buber's letter that I want to analyze before you go back to your breakout rooms. So let me read to you parts of Gandhi's letter. My sympathies are all with Jews. They have been the untouchables of Christianity, the Dalit in Hinduism. The parallel between their treatment by Christians and the treatment of untouchables by Hindus is very close. But my sympathies do not blind me to the requirements of justice. The cry for a national home for the Jews does not make much appeal to me. Why should they not, like other peoples of the earth, make that country their home where they were born and where they earn their livelihood? Palestine belongs to the Arabs, and in the same sense that England belongs to the English or France to the French. It is wrong and inhumane to oppose the Jews on the Arabs. Surely it would be a crime against humanity to reduce the proud Arabs so that Palestine can be restored to the Jews partly or wholly as their national home. The nobler course would be to insist on a just treatment of Jews wherever they are born and bred. The Jews born in France are French in precisely the same sense that Christians born in France are French. This cry for the national home affords a colorable justification for the German expulsion of the Jews. But the German persecution of the Jews seems to have no parallel in history. The tyrants of old never went so mad as Hitler seems to have gone, and he is doing it with religious zeal. For he is propounding a new religion of exclusive and militant nationalism, in the name of which an inhumanity becomes an act of humanity to be rewarded. Can the Jews resist this organized and shameless persecution? No person who has faith in a living God need feel helpless or forlorn. If I were a Jew born in Germany, I would claim Germany as my home, even as the tallest Gentile German may, and challenge him to shoot me or cast me in the dungeon. I would refuse to be expelled or to submit to discriminating treatment. I should not wait for fellow Jews to join me in civil resistance, but would have confidence that in the end, the rest are bound to follow my example. And a word of the Jews of Palestine. I have no doubt they are going about things the wrong way. The Palestine of the biblical conception is not a geographical tract. It is in their hearts. Jews can settle in Palestine only by the goodwill of Arabs. They should seek to convert the Arab heart. The same God rules the Arab heart who rules the Jewish heart. There are hundreds of ways of reasoning with the Arabs if they will only discard the help of the British bayonet. As it is, they are co-sharers with the British in despoiling a people who have done no wrong to them. I'm not defending the Arab excesses. I wish they had chosen the way of nonviolence in resisting what they rightly regarded as an unwarrantable encroachment upon their country. Let the Jews who claim to be the chosen race prove their title by choosing the way of nonviolence for vindicating their position on earth. Every country on earth is their home, including Palestine, not by aggression, but by loving service. So you see that Gandhi is making the case that Jews shouldn't impose themselves onto Arabs, regardless of their situation in Germany. And he's counseling them to remain where they were and to pursue satyagraha. In Sanskrit, it means a soul force, actually literally holding the truth, but it's a determined nonviolent resistance to evil, even to death. That in fact, by being persecuted, the persecutors are learning the worst punishment. And so Zionism for him during this period, and he recognizes that Zionism had roots going back 60, 70 years, still was not a tenable response. The sympathy for Jews he held could not blind him to the requirements of justice. Palestine, he declared, belongs to the Arabs, for the objectives of Zionism could not be reconciled with the rights of the indigenous Arab population. So think back to what Buber was arguing in Ha'ol and his Zionism. The fact for Buber is that they were going to build the land together. But for Gandhi, that's just an excess form of colonialism. To win over the Arab heart means that you're going to win it over by force with the British bayonet. He's calling out Zionist practices as opposed to Buber Zionist principles. But Buber responds. He acknowledged that Zionist settlement did infringe on the rights of indigenous Arabs. He's very clear about that. Calling attention to the word justice, Buber questioned whether justice could be served by calling on Jews, as Gandhi had, to realize God's commandment to be a chosen people by choosing nonviolence instead of Zionism. His reply really, as we'll see, in effect, is it just? Is it an act of justice to sacrifice the natural Jew on the altar of the supernatural Jew? Meaning most Jews who were being persecuted were not religious. They were secularized. And should they be held to the religious principles that Gandhi is holding on to them, or even a traditionalist Jew, when they didn't choose this? What was happening to them was simply unjust. And so for Buber, he sees Gandhi missing an essential point. And we're gonna look at that now. But you, the man of goodwill, do you not know that you must see him whom you address in his place and circumstance and in the throes of his destiny? Jews are being persecuted, robbed, maltreated, tortured, murdered. Now, do you know or do not know, Mahatma, what a concentration camp is like or what goes on there? Do you know of the torments in the concentration camp, of its methods of slow and quick slaughter? And this is before Auschwitz. And do you think perhaps that a Jew in Germany could pronounce in public on a single sentence of speech such as yours without being knocked down? An effective stand in the form of nonviolence may be taken against the unfeeling human beings in the hope of gradually bringing them to their senses, but a diabolic universal steamroller cannot thus be withstood. Satyagraha works when you're dealing with people who have a moral compass. What happens when all morality has been thrown out the window? The Jew, and Buber here is referring to the natural Jew, needs a motherland. Just like the oppressed Hindus of South Africa sought the comforting security of the great mother India, apparently you are entirely unaware of the fundamental differences existing between nations having such a mother. It need not necessarily be a great mother. It may be a tiny motherkin, but yet a mother's bosom and a mother's heart. And a nation that is orphaned, or to whom one says in speaking of his country, there is no more your mother. So remember, we've broached it in the last few classes, the German term Die Geborgenheit, right? That feeling of security, that feeling of mutual trust when you see your mother, or when you see a familiar face in a crowd. That sense that becomes the relationship that can grant you access to the ineffable, the experience of revelation, requires a motherland for Buber. That if you are orphaned, the conditions for thou and you encounters diminishes. And that it is interesting that this desire for the mother for Buber plays such a strong role in his biography. It plays such a strong role in his understanding of language, not having a mother tongue. And then in his political life, not having a motherland, right? So Buber is not home anywhere. He doesn't have that feeling of Geborgenheit. He's speaking Hebrew. He's in a contested land. The land in which he formed his intellectual life is Germany, that expelled him. And so for Buber, Zionism is a way to create the conditions for this mother or little mother, motherkin. And you ask, so Mahatma, you ask, why should they not, like the other nations of the earth, make that country their home, where they are born and where they earn their livelihood? Because their destiny is different from that of all other nations of the earth. It is a destiny which in truth and justice should not be imposed on any nation on earth. So in the study of history of Jews, it's a history of dispersion. It's a history of ghettoization. It's a history of being thrown out of countries. It's a history of never having a sense of Die Geborgenheit, because you were always on the move. The language was not always necessarily yours. The culture wasn't always necessarily yours. You were always an outsider if you were a Jew. And in truth and justice should not be imposed on any group of people on earth. For Buber, Jews had been denied the basic human rights to a mother or to a motherland, right? So he's speaking metaphorically. But their destiny is dispersion, not the dispersion of a fraction and the preservation of the main substance, as in the case of other nations. It is a dispersion without the living heart and center, and every nation has a right to demand the possession of a living heart. So for him, Palestine would be the living heart for the Jewish experience. It doesn't mean that all Jews need to live there, but it needs to have its living heart pumping life into Jews in diasporic communities. It's a sense of gravity. It's a sense of self. And so Buber is really taking issue with Gandhi's readings of Zionism. So Zionism as the third way for Buber. it's based on the premise that no solution is to be found in the life of isolated individuals. The true solution can be only issued forth from the life of a community that begins to carry out the will of God, often without being aware of doing so, even without believing that God exists and that is in his will. So the idea is that that you build this community in this land, create these conditions for thous and eternal thous, that when everyone participates in it, even those who don't believe it are affected and influenced by it. He said we cannot renounce the Jewish claim to Palestine. Something even higher than the life of our people is bound up with the land, namely the work that is divine mission. And so for Buber, he's also saying that what kept the Jewish people motivated in their mission to the world was this hope of the land of Israel. It was an eschatological hope, but it also, in the late 19th century, became a political hope. And so what he's suggesting is just as difficult as it would be to convert the hearts of indigenous Arabs, it's also equally difficult to convert the heart of exiled Jews who live in exile, feel exile. And Buber acknowledged that this mission does not absolve Jews of the duty to understand and honor the claim that is opposed to ours and to endeavor to reconcile both claims. So if you remember, Buber in a long passage talks about how the fate of nation building is always conquest, that the people who are always considered indigenous got there through violence themselves, and that there's this irrevocable or irresolvable conflict in which people conquer land, become native to that land, then that land gets conquered, right? It's a violent history of memory and forgetting, whereas the scars and the pain of that violence always endures. And so he suggests that this is a new way forward, that rather than conventional colonialism, he's imagining a more noble colonial effort. And he is cognizant that this is a form of colonialism. So for your breakout rooms, I did it in time too. You can also still try to figure out answers to the previous questions, but for this breakout room, kindly discuss Gandhi's and Buber's debate. What's the disagreement? What's the solution? I gave you some material, but those of you who read both letters in their entirety, you can offer some more insight into what their argument was. Both Buber and Gandhi drew inspiration from their religious traditions in their peace work. Peace work is by its very nature political. What happens when religious views of peace conflict with each other in regard to real-world politics? How can we chart a way forward together? So how do we respect another person's view of peace if that view of peace is in conflict with my own? If religious difference is a powerful force for good, as we at this organization believe, how can interreligious dialogue inspire productive peace work between communities? So you have 20 minutes in your breakout rooms, and these are your 3 questions. And then we'll come back. Actually, because I was on time, you can be rewarded, and you can have 25 minutes in your breakout rooms. And then we'll come back at 8:45 and we'll do a little Q&A. So thank you all for attending tonight. I know that Buber is a provocative thinker, and it's interesting to see how I-thou philosophies translate into political life. I'm really grateful for the time that we spent doing this today. Next week, we're going to explore the dialogical community and how we can use his principles of dialogue, both politically and theologically, to build interreligious networks that can hopefully affect some positive change in the world. Looking forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you for everything. Have a good night.